The Haunting Tales of Dark Shivering. Dark Shivering is a village lost on the border of England and Wales. Hidden between two countries, claimed by neither, and heeded by both. I've collected old stories passed down through generations which have been considered fairy stories. But when the wind groans, and the man in your closet stares at you, you know there are no fairy tales here. Ghost House. The house on Watery Lane had a disturbing history behind it. It had been built in 1885 using local stone. It hadn't even had its roof fitted before the first unfortunate event occurred. Its owner and builder Peter Albright had somehow fallen down the stone cellar steps, leaving him dead, only to be found by his wife Mrs. Albright later that night. Mrs. Albright continued on with building the house and even farmed the land as best she could. She had 4 sons to feed and clothe. Being a widow meant she relied on them to pull their weight too. Rumors had already begun about the ghost of Mr. Albright being seen on the property, enjoying the house and land that he was never able to whilst he was alive. Although Mrs. Albright lived there until her death in 1945. She endured the heartbreak of losing all 4 sons as she grew old and frail alone. One boy had hung himself in the cellar of the house, 2 sons were killed in the war, and she nursed her last treasured son on his deathbed when his body was ravaged by disease. In her final days, the house and land had become run down and unmanageable. Everything was overgrown and the house was in need of some repair. With no family left to benefit from the house, it stood abandoned and empty. By the 1970s, the house was doing surprisingly well. It still had its roof on, the windows were not broken, and no vandals had ruined its original features. Back in the 1970s, it would have taken a bus ride to get to Watery Lane from anywhere. Then a mile trek up the lane to find locked gates. No one back then could be bothered with that. They were too busy trying to earn ends meet. It was the 1980s that saw the stories of Watery Farm being told in the local pub, and so this attracted teenagers to investigate the house at night and dare each other to spend time in the house alone. Although the teenagers had climbed through the outside cellar door, which was heavily rotted, no further damage was done to the property. In 1983, Barry and his friends had decided in the school holidays to spend the night in the house. They'd heard stories of other teenagers seeing ghosts there, and so Barry and his friends wanted to go and see for themselves. They arrived there at nearly 9 at night, after catching the 8:10 bus that passed Watery Lane. It took them over half an hour to walk up the overgrown track. It was still light and warm, and they joked around as the house came into sight. It was a lot bigger than they had imagined, but just as the other kids had told them, they easily entered the house by the rotting cellar door. The air smelled damp and musty, and the cellar was cold compared to the air outside. The friends were all still gung-ho about seeing a ghost inside the house. That was until a loud bang was heard from upstairs, and suddenly Barry found himself alone as his mates had scarpered out the cellar door. So much for being brave, thought Barry. He wasn't going anywhere. Staying the night here meant he didn't have to do any chores for a whole month too, because his brother would be doing them. He'd bet there was no way Barry would stay the night in the ghost house. He was also going to collect big on chocolate and sweets, as his friends had no faith in him either. Barry left the cellar and found himself in a pleasant hallway. Everything was decaying and old, but you could see that once upon a time it had been a nice place. He wandered into the lounge room and could see remnants of an old Ouija board on the floor. Someone had lit some candles, and there was a Bible sat on what was left of the sofa. Barry was fighting hard to not let the atmosphere of the house affect him. He tried to keep his mind occupied with exploring the old house, rather than hunting for ghosts. Barry expected his friends to come back in after gaining their composure, but as an hour came and went, he had a feeling they had caught the last bus back to the village. What a load of wimps. Barry was surprised that at least Stephen didn't stay. His own house was creepier than this place in the daytime. After looking through the old house, holding his breath before opening every door, Barry decided he was going to camp out in the dining room. He didn't fancy being too far from his escape route. The house had become dark inside, making it hard to see with just a small torch. Barry decided to use the table as a tent. He grabbed a blanket from one of the upstairs bedrooms and tied it to each leg. He felt much safer inside his makeshift tent for some reason. As he settled inside the tent, he took some food out of his backpack and a comic. If he read for a while and ate his food, he'd soon be off to sleep and the morning would come that much faster. He wasn't wrong. After filling up on sandwiches, cakes and biscuits, Barry's eyes were soon heavy, and even though he could feel a cold draft blowing in his tent, he soon fell asleep. Barry didn't know what time he woke up, but it was still dark. He lay there trying to remember where he was. He could hear someone moving around in the kitchen. It sounded like someone doing their chores, moving cups, stirring their tea even. It took Barry a while to realize it wasn't his mum downstairs in their kitchen making these familiar sounds. Suddenly Barry was very awake and alert. He sat there listening, not daring to breathe. Who could be out there? Was it his friends come back to find him? A tramp looking for shelter? His mind raced with ideas as he sat not daring to move. He'd have to peek through the blanket and see what predicament he'd gotten himself in. He moved as slowly as he could in case someone heard him, and he made the tiniest of slits in the blanket to see out. He pushed his eye up to the slit, but as soon as he could see the room, silence surrounded him. His hairs began to rise on his body, and he waited to see when someone was going to move in the room again. He felt like he'd stared through that slit for an hour before feeling safe enough to breathe properly again. He closed the slit and lay back. As he did so, he was sure he could hear the faint noises begin again. He sat there unsure what to do. A freezing cold draft blew past his foot. To his horror, he looked down and saw that his foot was outside of the tent. He was just about to move it back in, when he heard a man's voice growl and a large, cold hand grab onto his foot. Barry screamed. He jumped up from his tent, kicking the hand off him and crashing the table behind him upside down. He looked for his escape route and could see there was no one in the room with him. He wasn't hanging around to meet anyone. He carried on screaming and ran towards the cellar door. Terrified to be in the house and terrified to go to the cellar, he was driven on by sheer panic. The only way out was the cellar, and so he had to go down there. In seconds he was rushing towards the steps, only to see the image of an angry man at the bottom of them. The man looked at Barry and raised his hand. He began gesturing for Barry to go towards him, but Barry was terrified. He sprinted back into the house and headed upstairs as far from the dining room and cellar as possible. As he flew up the stairs to the first floor, he could hear loud bootfalls behind him. He daren't look. He didn't want to see that old man's face again as long as he lived. He ran straight into the first bedroom he came to, and rolled quickly under the bed. The old bedding was rotten and hung down either side of the bed, giving him some extra cover from whoever or whatever entered the room. He lay there as still as he could, listening to the footsteps coming ever closer to the room. He watched, shaking, as he saw the old man enter the room slowly and walk towards the bed as if searching for him. Barry could just see the old man's legs and boots moving around the room until he finally stopped at the side of the bed. Barry knew the old man was going to look under the bed. And he was terrified. He closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable. He started whimpering quietly to himself until he finally opened his eyes. And to his horror, the old man was next to him under the bed. Barry's eyes watered with fear, and the old man growled at him. "Got you." It was all too much for Barry. He screamed as loud as he could and shot out from under the bed, heading straight for the cellar once more. He sped down the stairs to see the old man at the bottom step once again, but this time Barry closed his eyes and ran straight through him. His body froze up. His hairs stood on end, but he kept running towards the outside door. When he made it into the overgrown garden, Barry didn't stop running. He ran, and ran without looking back. At the bottom of Watery Lane, he saw his friends all stood around the tent they'd brought with them. They started shouting his name, and told him to stop, but there was no way Barry was stopping. He ran all the way home. Barry won his bet to stay in the ghost house overnight, but it was far from a joyful win. Barry moved away from the area in the late 1990s, and that would have been the end of his story. Until the house sold in 2018. Barry moved back to the area in the same year. And who was the new owner of the house? Barry, of course. Dark Shivering has lots more stories to give up, and I'm always collecting them for future books. Join me next time for more haunting tales of Dark Shivering. Don't forget to click like and subscribe so you never miss another ghostly episode.